April 10th, 1912, the largest ship ever built to date set sail from Southampton, England for New York Harbor. But it never made it there. Over the decades, there have been several studies and theories about what went wrong on that fateful journey. But there's one story about that doomed ship's short life above water that's never been told. Here now, for the first time, is the untold mystery of murder on the Titanic. New York City detective Lieutenant Joseph DeLuca traveled to London for a 2-week seminar about new techniques in crime scene examination given by the good folks at Scotland Yard. His trip over aboard the Olympia was far from glamorous. Packed like sardines in third class, he may as well have just locked himself inside a shipping container. At least then he could have avoided the dozens of people who suffered from motion sickness. The rough waters were harrowing. Some of the passengers didn't even make it to the side of the boat when they were sick. So each day added another layer of filth and wretched odor. You would never expect the department to spring for first-class passage, but Joe felt a little old to be bunking forward to a cabin. The trip back to New York promised to be a much nicer experience. He would be in a second-class cabin by himself aboard the maiden voyage of the White Star Line's newest ship, the Titanic. The ship was all the rage. Gossip columns eagerly printed the well-known list of famous and wealthy passengers who had purchased staterooms for this shiny new boat. White Star had bragged about its power and speed, not to mention its size. Joe didn't much care for all the hoopla, what with the first-class passengers and their entourages. He was a blue-collar guy. He worked for a living. As far as he was concerned, every person, rich or poor, is just like every other person, capable of good and bad. As far as Joe saw it, this would be an interesting experiment in class division. Never before had a ship carried all 3 classes aboard. So many people of varying economic statuses, all confined to one relatively small location, even if it was the largest moving object in the world. Joe was just settling into his tiny second-class cabin when there was a knock on the door. It seems his room had been double-booked, and Joe would have to share the room after all. His would-be bunkmate entered, wide-eyed and apologetic, carrying a single beat-up brown leather suitcase. His name was William Hawkins, and he was off to America to start a new life. He eagerly shook Joe's hand and amiably asked which bed Joe preferred. As he unpacked, William chattered on about how he couldn't wait to be somewhere sunnier and more positive than England, and have someone call him Billy. As far as William was concerned, this was what America was all about. As annoyed as Joe was at first about the inconvenience of having to share the cramped space, he welcomed the company, and William Hawkins seemed harmless. The first night in the second-class dining room, all throughout dinner, William Hawkins was extremely interested in what Joe had learned during his visit. Crime detection had always fascinated William. He'd thought about becoming a policeman when he got to America. Perhaps Joe could recommend him, give him a leg up in the job market. Joe humored him, although he had never been a fan of risking his reputation on someone else's abilities. Who knows, maybe in the coming days William will prove himself worthy of trust. Joe didn't like to jump to conclusions. He was too methodical in his work to allow anything like that to bleed into his personal life. As William carried on about some of his favorite solved crimes in their lifetime, their waiter loomed suspiciously by them. Joe found it difficult to concentrate on William's story, and he didn't want to be rude. So he turned to the waiter and asked if there was something particularly interesting about their table. The waiter didn't answer him. He just quickly scurried away to the next table. Once there, the waiter was verbally accosted by the guests at that table. Seems they had asked for a cake shovel 5 minutes before, and were still waiting on it. The waiter apologized. He was not familiar with that term. The woman at the table shouted at him, questioning his abilities as a server on such a prestigious ship. A cake shovel, she explained, was a pie server. Certainly any idiot knows that. The waiter hurried off to the kitchen for the requested item. When he returned, the woman took it from him and threw it on the ground, which caused a loud clanging noise, drawing the attention of the entire dining room. Apparently, a proper cake shovel has a serrated edge. Any fool should know this. William was embarrassed for the waiter. He couldn't believe the woman could behave so rudely to the staff. Moreover, how could her husband allow his wife to behave so rudely? Certainly the husband should be ashamed of her. Joe chose to ignore it and suggested to William that they carry on and enjoy their meal. Shortly after, the couple at the next table began arguing. The wife was complaining to no end that she'd rather they had purchased a first-class cabin. The husband explained that no more first-class cabins were available for purchase. Not to mention the commitment. It wasn't a one-way ticket. It was property, theirs forever. She assured him that after he secured the contract waiting for him in New York, that they'd be traveling across the Atlantic so often, he'll have wished he had purchased that first-class stateroom then. He reminded her that the contract wasn't a guarantee. Alistair Prowse was also bidding on the same contract. She couldn't help herself and quickly pointed out that Prowse had bought a stateroom on the Titanic. Perhaps he knew something they didn't. Again, William turned his nose up at this garish behavior. People should not air their dirty laundry in public. Joe, on the other hand, thought nothing of it. He was a New Yorker, after all. After dinner, while retiring to their cabin, Joe and William heard a ruckus in the next room. They quickly went down the hallway just in time to see a maid fleeing the room in tears. Down the hall, a bellboy stopped her to comfort her, but she pushed past him and ran out of sight. Joe asked the bellboy what the problem was. He told Joe that the Cawtherys had treated her terribly ever since they boarded. They were making her life miserable. Joe and William peeked inside the door of the next cabin, only to see that it was the same arguing couple that sat near them at dinner. The bellboy whispered to them in confidence that his last wish was to throw both of them overboard, straight into the Atlantic. Joe and William ate breakfast separately, agreeing to meet back in the room before exploring the ship. When Joe arrived back in the room, he heard a scream. He rushed to the next cabin to find Mrs. Cawthorey in hysterics. Standing in the middle of the room with a frightened look on his face was that same bellboy. On the floor was Mr. Cawthorey. Sticking out of his back was a cake shovel. Join us next time as we continue the untold story of murder on the Titanic. On April 11th, 1912, while sailing aboard the maiden voyage of the Titanic, New York City detective Joseph DeLuca discovered a murder victim in the second-class cabin next to his. We now continue the untold story of murder on the Titanic. The victim was a Mr. Nigel Cawthorey, a successful English architect who was traveling to New York with his wife Claire in order to secure a lucrative and important contract to design and build a new neighborhood on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. In most cases, having a detective from New York City on hand would be a great benefit for solving the crime. Serendipitous, you could say. So the purser on the ship, a Mr. Edward Bevins, took to action. His first task was to move Mrs. Cawthorey into a vacant first-class cabin, a stateroom that had been purchased but not used for this first trip across the Atlantic. Mrs. Cawthorey was more than happy to accept the accommodations. After all, first class was what she had wanted all along. Then Mr. Bevins took to solving the crime. He'd never had to deal with a murder before. His experiences aboard every White Star ship had been seamless up until now. In fact, he wasn't even sure where to start the investigation. Mr. Bevins was in over his head. Edward Bevins did what anyone would do in his situation. He went to Joe's second-class cabin to ask him for assistance. Joe's unintended cabin mate, William Hawkins, was thrilled at this prospect. He'd have a front-row seat to a real criminal investigation. However, Joe was hesitant to get involved. It wasn't his jurisdiction. This was the open sea. This was a matter for the purser and White Star and their offices back in Liverpool. Edward understood Joe's perspective, but he was desperate for help. How should he begin the investigation? He'd be happy with just a hint at this point. Joe capitulated and offered a starting block. He suggested that Edward should work backwards from the crime scene. Who was there? What did they see? And if he got stuck in his investigation, try and forget that Joe was even on board. The purser, Mr. Bevins, took Joe's advice. He would start with the bellboy, Dudley Moss. Dudley was young, wiry. He had a boyish face, but there was a darkness in his eyes that Edward found troubling. Dudley was discovered standing over the body of Nigel Cawthry. Certainly, he must have seen something. So he detained Dudley. The circumstances hardly qualified him as guilty, but he wanted to question him. And he didn't want Dudley to try and hide. Titanic, remember, was a huge ship. One could easily get lost or hide and slip off the ship once they arrived in New York. Once he had the bellboy in his private office, Edward began questioning him about that morning's ordeal. Edward asked about Dudley's morning duties, where he was. Could anyone verify his whereabouts? Like a seasoned criminal, Dudley was icy, and he kept silent, refusing to answer any of Mr. Bevins' questions. Frustrated, the purser left to go interrogate other staff members about Dudley's assignments. He ordered that the bellboy was to be watched around the clock. As soon as she heard word of Dudley's incarceration, the maid who was seen fleeing the Cawthry's room went to Joe's cabin and knocked on the door. Her name was Catherine Dolman. She was graceful, fresh-faced, with clear yet anxious eyes. She begged Joe for his help. She knew Dudley couldn't have done it. Joe asked how could she be so sure. She claimed Dudley was with her in another cabin when they heard the screams. Joe reminded her that he was not investigating the murder, and any concerns she had should be directed toward the purser. She explained that the purser wouldn't understand, since fraternizing amongst the staff was strictly discouraged. Not that she and Dudley were involved, but they had a long history. Catherine revealed to Joe that she and Dudley grew up together in Southampton. Childhood friends, never sweethearts. But Dudley had clearly always hoped for something to happen. When Catherine heard about the job opportunities aboard the Titanic, she immediately applied. When Dudley heard she was sailing, he begged his way into a job, any job that was available. Being a bellboy was far below his level of education. He was very bright and shouldn't lower himself. She knew he only took the job to be with her. And she was flattered. He would do anything for her. At this point, Joe couldn't help himself. His detective skills kicked in, and he asked Catherine about the previous night. He saw her leaving the Cawthry's cabin in tears. She dismissed the episode as just another occasion when she took something too personally. Catherine admitted that she must learn to grow a thicker skin. Joe pointed out that the bellboy was right there to comfort her. Perhaps he didn't think of it as something so trivial. Perhaps Dudley thought of it as something that shouldn't be ignored or forgiven. Perhaps He wouldn't stand to have his childhood friend embarrassed like that. Across the room, William Hawkins perked up and said, "Don't look now, Joe, but you're establishing a motive." Joe sighed and then showed Catherine to the door, ending the conversation, as well as his involvement in the case. Later that night, William approached the subject of the murder again. He asked Joe if he thought the purser was even capable of actually solving the crime. Edward Bevins was an intelligent man. One didn't rise to his level of employment without ambition and adeptness. But this was out of his realm. It'd be a shame for the real killer to get away with it, if indeed Bevins has the wrong man in custody. Certainly Dudley the bellboy had a motive, albeit an immature one. He had a schoolboy crush on his childhood friend, which led him to act irrationally enough to beg for a job that was beneath him. Perhaps he was impulsive enough to commit such a brutal act. But weren't there others on the ship who had equal motive? Joe quickly responded that of course there were others. And surely the purser would interrogate all of the suspects in due time. Joe did not wish to speak about the matter anymore and preferred to close the subject. Unsatisfied by the conversation, William headed to Edward Bevins' office to speak with him about the investigation. As an amateur sleuth himself, William Hawkins offered the purser any help he could give and immediately began asking pertinent questions about the crime. What was the murder weapon? A cake shovel with a serrated edge. Had Bevins spoken with all of the witnesses? Had he established a motive yet? The purser seemed flustered. He was doing the best he could, but there was little doubt he could use some help. All he knew about murder investigations was the little he had read in newspapers. And even then, having been working for White Star for over 10 years, newspapers hadn't exactly been available. Only those scraps they could gather in port. He was grateful to William Hawkins for volunteering. Perhaps between the two of them, they could narrow the investigation and maybe even solve the crime. At that moment, Joe entered the office. He had been listening to their conversation at the door. Joe apologized for not stepping in sooner, but he understood now that he had a civic duty to do his part, to offer up his expertise. And with that, William Hawkins, the purser Edward Bevins, and second-class passenger New York City detective Joseph DeLuca set out to catch the killer. Join us next time as we continue the untold story of murder on the Titanic. On April 12, 1912, New York City Detective Joseph DeLuca began heading up an investigation into the murder of one of the passengers aboard the maiden voyage of the Titanic. We now continue the untold story of murder on the Titanic. Joe and his team of William Hawkins and Edward Bevins began their investigation that Friday morning with a visit to the wife and widow of the murder victim, Mrs. Claire Cawthry, now in her first-class cabin. Mrs. Cawthry seemed very comfortable in her new digs, not the least bit the grieving widow you would expect. Mr. Bevins performed his regular duty of assuring Mrs. Cawthry's contentment. A purser's habits are hard to break. She had few concerns or complaints, with the exception of the staff. It seemed regardless of where one stayed aboard this ship, the staff was disappointing. While still discussing her demands, Alistair Prowse popped in to share his condolences. Mr. Prowse was a large man, robust, with a big personality to match. Joe took the opportunity to ask Mr. Prowse where he was the morning Mr. Cawthry was murdered. Alistair Prowse fumbled for an answer, clearly taken aback that he was even being questioned about such a gruesome thing. William piped in that he was as much of a suspect as anyone else. After all, wasn't that big contract in New York all but a guarantee now that Nigel Cawthry was out of the way? Mr. Prowse, practically unable to hide his delight in hearing his good fortune spoken aloud by someone else, concurred that certainly the prospect of him landing the Upper East Side contract was very important to him, but hardly something he'd be willing to commit murder over. Joe then brought William Hawkins and Edward Bevins to the scene of the crime so that they could review the facts. How Mr. Cawthry was found, how the murder weapon was used, where the bellboy was standing, where Mrs. Cawthry entered, and what she saw. Mr. Cawthry's body was found face down, but not in a natural state. It looked posed. His right arm was pointing straight up above his head. His left arm was pointing straight out away from his body, bent at the elbow. Most strange was his legs were straight and together. Certainly that's not how someone would fall after being stabbed. The cake shovel was buried deep in Mr. Cawthry's back on the left side, the handle clearly leaning to the left. Amateur sleuth William proudly declared that the killer must be left-handed. Joe allowed William his moment and gave him credit for this discovery. Dudley, the bellboy, was standing 2 steps to the right of the body, looking down, frozen with fear. When Mrs. Cawthry entered from the hall, she saw the body and screamed. She claimed that Dudley did not move. Joe and the other men went back to Mr. Bevins' office to speak with Dudley, who was still in custody. The bellboy was still unwilling to speak about the incident for fear of incriminating his friend Catherine, and continued to dance around the questions that Joe asked. Frustrated, Joe asked Bevins to give Dudley and him a minute alone. While Bevins was out of the room, Joe told Dudley what Catherine had told him regarding their history. He then told Dudley that Catherine admitted to being alone with Dudley when the murder took place. He had asked the purser to leave so that Dudley and Catherine wouldn't get in trouble, hoping Dudley would see this act of kindness as a sign that Joe could be trusted. But still, Dudley admitted to nothing. Then Joe raised his voice in an attempt to intimidate the young bellboy.
Maybe she was covering for Dudley, or maybe he was covering for her. Or maybe the two of them were in this together. After transferring Dudley to a different office for holding, Joe and William went in search of Catherine. Along their trek, William spotted the waiter from the second-class dining room that served them that first night. William reminded Joe of the episode in the dining room with the cake shovel and the Cawthorys. It was clear to both men that they should interview the waiter next. Joe arranged for that waiter to be brought to the purser's office as soon as possible. Continuing on, Joe and William found Catherine in the laundry room. They reviewed with her what she had told them previously, but now asked for specific details in order to solidify her alibi, as well as Dudley's. Catherine was unwilling to share anything personal, and was insulted that they would ask for such details. Joe informed her of his suspicion that they were working together and had agreed upon this tale of a private moment far away from the murder. Joe threatened her with serious consequences once they arrived in New York. Joe's menacing tactic worked. Catherine panicked and told them everything. Back in the purser's office, the waiter was nervous. His name was Philip. He was tall, gaunt. His complexion was gray, like he hadn't been out in the sun for several years. He didn't make eye contact with anyone in the room. William Hawkins took the lead and asked William questions about the Cawthorys. William was hoping that Philip would show a hint of malice toward the Cawthorys after their mistreatment of him in the dining room that first night. Philip sat quietly, only responding with simple answers. No, their behavior had not bothered him. Yes, he was used to that. No, he never visited their cabin in second class. Then Mr. Bevins asked questions, taking more of the good cop routine, suggesting that he knew how difficult passengers could be. After all, he had dealt with demanding passengers his entire career. He could see how easily a staff member could snap. Again, Philip simply responded, no. He never thought of harming a passenger. He, too, had dealt with nagging passengers for a long time. Having had enough of this cold, removed testimony, Joe cut in and finally asked Philip flat out if he knew who the killer was. For the first time, Philip looked up, directly into Joe's eyes, and simply said, yes. In her first-class cabin, Claire Cawthory continued to enjoy the charms of her new beau, Alistair Prouse. They discovered through their new budding romance that they had more in common than they had previously known. And it looked like Claire Cawthory would now be escorting Mr. Prouse to New York, and would be on his arm for the rest of his journey, even staying with him at the rooms he had reserved at the plaza. The evening wore on. Mr. Prouse, being the old-fashioned gentleman that he was, determined that he should call it a night and go back to his own room before it gets too late. After all, there was a murderer on the loose. Alistair Prouse hadn't taken 3 steps from Mrs. Cawthory's stateroom door when he discovered the body of Philip, the waiter, lying face down, stabbed in the back with a cake shovel.
Join us next time as we continue the untold story of murder on the Titanic. On April 14th, 1912, New York City detective Joseph DeLuca was investigating two murders that had occurred aboard the maiden voyage of the Titanic. We now continue the untold story of murder on the Titanic. The investigation had reached a frenzied state. Edward Bevins, the purser, could hardly believe that this could happen on any White Star ship, never mind the maiden voyage of their pride and joy, the ship of dreams. William Hawkins, amateur sleuth and Joe's accidental cabin mate, could hardly believe his good fortune. He had always dreamed of becoming a policeman, and here he was, helping a New York City detective solve not just one homicide, but two. For Joe, it was just another day on the job. He had seen his fair share of murders, even multiple homicides. But this case was different. There was a lot of ins and outs, what have yous, etc. He needed to be careful. He also needed to be quick before the killer struck again. Joe needed to reapproach the original crime scene, given the similarity of the two murders. There was no doubt that the two were connected. That was obvious. The weapon used in both murders was identical, a serrated cake shovel. The method of killing was precisely the same as well, stabbed in the back. In fact, the killer had even positioned the bodies in the exact same position, or pose, if you will. Face down with the right arm pointing straight up and the left arm pointing straight out with the elbow bent at a right angle. Both legs were together and straight. Certainly all of these specifics couldn't be a coincidence. Either the killer was the same for both murders, or Joe had a copycat killer on his hands. The only way for the second murder to have been committed by a second culprit was that that person would have to have witnessed the first crime scene, or had intimate knowledge of the crime scene. How else would they know about the positioning of the bodies? Certainly people aboard the ship had heard about Mr. Cawthry's murder, and maybe even the weapon used was common knowledge. But the specifics of how his body was found, that information was precious. And as Joe saw it, that really narrowed his suspect list. As a result, he may be able to wrap this up in no time. So, he needed to speak with Dudley the bellboy again, as well as the widow, Mrs. Claire Cawthry. Cawthry was in an utter panic, inconsolable, fearing for her life as well as Alistair Prowse's life, whom she had all but wrapped up to be her new meal ticket. She had even managed to move into Mr. Prowse's staterooms. The helpless damsel couldn't be left alone after all. Joe and William visited Mr. Prowse and Mrs. Cawthry that Sunday evening. The new couple was just preparing to leave for the first-class dining salon when Joe asked to speak to them about the murders. Mrs. Cawthry, having taken on an even more exaggerated version of herself, begged to be left alone. Hadn't she suffered enough already? Mr. Prowse was very direct with Joe, that he had found the body of that poor waiter, a most grisly sight. And rather than wasting his time speaking with them, he should be out looking for the real killer. Clearly, neither of them had committed such an atrocity, and they could vouch for each other's whereabouts, their budding romance hardly a secret they wanted to keep. Joe and William left frustrated. There was only one suspect left, Dudley, the bellboy. Joe and William went in search of Dudley. After all, Dudley had been found standing over the body of Mrs. Cawthry. He was very familiar with the details of that crime scene. Certainly he could recreate the same situation with Philip the waiter. William and Joe discussed it as they walked. Dudley had motive. The love of his life, Catherine, had been humiliated by Mr. Cawthry. But why Philip? What was the point of killing him? Philip had told them that he knew who the killer was. But Dudley couldn't have known that. Something wasn't right. This didn't add up. Perhaps they should revisit the idea of Dudley and Catherine working together. William stopped suddenly. He had looked into an open door of one of the cabins, and there was Catherine and Dudley in an embrace. Two birds with one stone. Joe and William entered the cabin. Dudley and Catherine stepped apart, a natural knee-jerk reaction to being caught, as it were. Joe asked Dudley if he had ever spoken with Philip the waiter. He had not. And Catherine? She knew who he was. She described him as cold and creepy. Joe asked if Philip had ever done anything to personally offend her, approached her, or threatened her in any way. He hadn't. Joe asked, then why kill him? The two young lovers were stunned at this. Even William was surprised to hear Joe accuse them. It was so out of character for him. Perhaps he knew something that he hadn't shared with William. Joe waited for his answer from Dudley and Catherine. They were scared. One murder was one thing, but to be accused of a double murder, their naivete was showing. Joe's intimidation was working. Dudley shouted, "You can't possibly believe that one of us is the killer." William suddenly remembered something and went to the desk of the cabin, grabbed a pen and a sheet of paper, and asked Dudley to write his name, only his name. Dudley took the pen with his right hand and wrote his name. William thanked him, and then asked Catherine to do the same. Catherine also took the pen with her right hand and wrote her name below Dudley's. William thanked her and asked Joe to have a word in the hall. William had shown Joe that neither Catherine nor Dudley were left-handed, something they had absolutely agreed upon, that the killer must have been left-handed. William suggested that they go back to first class and ask Mrs. Cawthry and Mr. Prowse to conduct the same test. They found Mr. Prowse and Mrs. Cawthry
cuddled up on a chaise lounge in Mr. Prowse's stateroom. Both clearly had had their share of champagne over dinner. The scene was repulsive to William. Nevertheless, he took control of the room and asked each of them to write their names on a sheet of paper, just as he had with Catherine and Dudley. When both of them wrote with their right hands, William turned to Joe. Something wasn't right. Perhaps they had missed something. Well, it was late. When they walked back to the purser's office to check in with Edward Bevins, he had written up a report to send to the White Star office in Liverpool. He thought it best if all three of them sign it to verify his findings. William happily signed at the bottom of the page, as did Joe. But at that moment, William felt a cold shudder run down his back. Joe signed it with his left hand. And just then, the Titanic struck an iceberg.
Join us next time as we continue the untold story of murder on the Titanic. On April 15, 1912, just after midnight, New York City Detective Joseph DeLuca avoided arrest and detainment on suspicion of murder when the Titanic struck an iceberg in the Atlantic Ocean. We now conclude the untold story of murder on the Titanic. At first, no one seemed that concerned about the damage. This ship was said to be unsinkable. The staff assured the passengers that they were only taking precautionary measures and all would be sorted in a short time. Edward Bevins, the purser, immediately turned to his assigned duties in the case of an emergency. He delegated to his staff the proper procedures for a lifeboat evacuation, with priority focus on the first class, women and children first. Solving the recent murders and capturing the killer suddenly did not seem all that important to Edward. There were more pressing matters at hand. He ordered his office to be cleared, and that William Hawkins and Joe DeLuca follow him to the first-class dining salon, where passengers were being gathered. But once they arrived, Joe had slipped away. Passengers were corralled on the first-class level where the lifeboats had been stored. It was an almost comical sight, some of the richest people in the world wearing life vests over their pajamas. There was a general confusion as to why they had been awoken and forced from their cozy cabins. No one seemed to give them any straight answers. One thing was for sure. No one wanted to get into the lifeboats.
It seemed absurd to everyone there. Why would anyone voluntarily get into a tiny, open-aired lifeboat to drift out onto the Atlantic Ocean in the freezing cold middle of the night, when they were safe and secure on a perfectly safe, unsinkable ship? Mrs. Claire Cawthry was amongst those who questioned the necessity of vacating this giant vessel, but her complaints fell on deaf ears as she was forced to board one of the lifeboats. Most of all, she was furious that Alistair was forced to stay on the ship. The rule was, women and children first, and Claire would rather have stayed safe with her new man. Alistair Prowse understood the circumstances and kept back, never forcing his way onto any of the lifeboats. Chivalry was not entirely dead. Mrs. Claire Cawthry would never see Alistair Prowse again. He was last seen helping one of the third-class passengers fasten their life vest. In a desperate scramble, William Hawkins raced to find Joe. He ran through the corridors of the cabins on several levels, up and down stairs. Finally, in the kitchen, off of the second-class dining room, he found him. Joe looked petrified. Not the strong, confident individual who led so many investigations. William had him cornered. He noted the irony that he should find Joe here. Doubtless the room from which he purloined the murder weapon. Joe said, yes, he did it. Both times. But why, William wanted to know. Joe explained. He'd always gotten away with it. For years. In fact, the new techniques he learned in Scotland Yard would require him to be even more careful. So many criminals, you see, immerse themselves into an investigation to avoid suspicion. What better way to do that than to become the investigator? He told William if he looked up unsolved homicides in New York City, he'd find a lot of his dirty work. At that moment, the lights went out, and the two men ran for the upper deck. There were only 20 lifeboats on the Titanic, not nearly enough for everyone on the ship. Hundreds of third-class passengers never even made it up to the deck. Every lifeboat required men to row. Dudley, the bellboy, was grabbed by an officer and thrust into a lifeboat and ordered to row. He turned around and saw Catherine standing on the deck still. He screamed for her to jump in, but she was blocked. Somehow, she managed to squeeze through, and she jumped as the boat was 15 feet below her, crashing onto several passengers. As their lifeboat hit the water, it was clear to those left aboard that that was the last lifeboat. There weren't any left. Everyone still on board would eventually end up in the freezing cold Atlantic Ocean, including the purser, Edward Bevins, who was last seen lowering the final lifeboat. His remains were never found. William felt the ship list more. He had to make a decision. Save his own life, or risk staying on the ship in the hopes that everyone would be saved and he would be a hero for capturing the killer. The choice was obvious. William jumped. As he swam through the freezing water towards a lifeboat, he could hear Joe shouting at him, mocking him for abandoning a confessed murderer. William was pulled to safety onto a lifeboat. When he turned around, he saw Joe standing on the top deck as the stern climbed higher, tipping the bow downward into the water. He saw Joe grab onto a railing, hanging on for dear life. Suddenly, the front smokestack fell over into the water, crushing anyone and anything beneath it, including Joe. After that, New York City detective Joseph DeLuca was never seen again. William Hawkins survived. He, along with the other survivors, were rescued by the Carpathia. He got to New York and immediately applied for a position on the police force. He told them of his harrowing experience aboard the Titanic. When asked if he ever met one of the victims of the boat, a detective named Joseph DeLuca, William said he hadn't. He never mentioned Joe or the murders to anyone. After all, who would believe him? He did eventually look into unsolved crimes, and what he found was not a surprise at all. Dozens of cold cases, homicides, clearly the work of a left-handed killer. We hope you've enjoyed Murder on the Titanic. Thanks for listening. Murder on the Titanic is a Cornelius and Barnaby production.